my name's Ryan Campbell, and I'm going to be doing a talk on custom metadata with Swiz. For those of you that use Flex, I'm sure you know what metadata is, but for those that don't, that could sound like a kind of a complex topic. But I'm going to try and walk you through the basics. First, I'll just introduce you to what Swiz is, and then I'll introduce you to what metadata is for those who don't know, and then I'll give some examples of metadata that's already being used with Flex. And after that, I will go into how Swiz can help you to start creating your own custom metadata, examples that are already out there, and also, lastly, I can show how to actually build one. So I'll start writing some code, and you can see one happen. So first, I'll just introduce myself. I live in Kelowna, BC, which is about a 50-minute plane ride above here, so similar weather and all that. I'm a Flex and Java developer mainly. Before that, I actually did a lot of HTML and Perl, PHP, stuff like that. But yeah, I think the last 3 years I've basically focused fully on Flex development and then any Java backends. I work with Universal Mind. I'm not sure of the exact date. I think it actually might be on Monday. I've actually been with them for 2 years now. So, and I've done 8 projects with them. So they're definitely a great company. And I thought I would just mention, since I'm in Seattle, my first conference that I ever went to was 360 Flex in Seattle in '07. It was kind of cool. I was doing HTML at the time, and I really liked Flex, but my work was not interested in Flash at all. My boss was like a Linux guy and hated the Flash player completely. So I won a ticket to 360 Flex, and I decided to quit my job because I figured if I'm going to learn Flex, I might as well use it. So it was kind of funny too, because it was either I would get good at Flex and make money at that, or I was going to go into construction with my dad. So luckily here I am still doing programming.
You're bored out.
Yeah, now my dad has to find someone else to run the company. So what's Swiz? So it's an open source application framework. Since this talk is so much about metadata, I don't want to get into all what an application framework should do, but for those of you familiar with, well, Swiz or Mate, Karen Gorm, things like that, it basically just helps you build an application so that it's structured in a way that you can extend it, and you're not doing things like putting all your logic and view in the same file. So a lot of the common concepts are like the model view controller, things like that it just helps you with. It's actively developed. A lot of the developers on it actually work at UM. We're currently at the 1.0 beta. We kind of jumped from, it was at 6 point something, and we've now moved to 1.0 because we've done a complete rewrite in order to do things like metadata processors. So the next thing is Swiz. It's mainly known for doing dependency injection and event mapping. So dependency injection, for those that don't know what that is basically instead of your class or your view creating the instances of the other classes that it requires, you have an outside component inject those into it. So inversion of control, instead of handling it yourself, you let someone else handle it. Event mapping is basically so dispatching any system events like save customer, instead of you talking to the code directly, that's going to map to a method that you can handle the code with. So lastly, I'll just mention that with Swiz, 0.6, dependency injection and event mapping was really what Swiz was known for. But now with 1.0, you can start doing things with metadata processors. So what's metadata? Basically, you can see the format of it here. And the idea is it's actually just plain text. You'll notice that with Flex if you've ever spelled bindable wrong and it doesn't work and you don't know why because there was no compiler checking or anything like that. You can place this above any class, property, or method just to give it extra details. So for example, a class, you could put event metadata to specify which events that class dispatches, and things like that. The idea also is you give it a name, and then you can have multiple properties or no properties. So that's just the basic syntax. And what it's mainly used for with Flex is it provides hints to the compiler. Like with the bindable tag, when you specify that, the compiler is actually dynamically generating code before it actually finally compiles your application. So instead of you having to write that code yourself, you can use one line of metadata and it's going to write common functionality for you. And lastly, and what we're doing with Swiz is you can parse that at runtime. So I can look up the metadata details that you put in your code and start doing stuff with it while the actual Swift is running. So bindable, I thought I would just show this as an example. It's if you do Flex, you've used this more than anything else. I won't get into major details, but basically you can see again with the format, there's one where there's no properties added to it, so the compiler is just going to use its defaults. There's one where you've specified the event, and this is basically saying whenever a customer's change event has been dispatched, you'll know that the list of customers has changed, so you should update that on your view. And the last example actually does the exact same thing as the one above it. It's just showing that with metadata, for example, with bindable, event is the default property, so you don't always have to specify event equals, things like that. And just to show how much metadata is actually used with Flex, Flex 4 has 22 different metadata tags. I was actually really surprised when I counted them. I've used most of them, but yeah, it's used a lot. Some of it you might not ever use. Some of them are used more internally by the Flex SDK developers, but ones like bindable, event are definitely the main ones. If you've done anything a little more custom components, you might start using default property, etc. So with Swiz, it actually came with 6 metadata tags included. The main one was Inject, which handles the dependency injection. The second one was Mediate, which handles mapping events to methods. And I'll get into both of those examples so you can see what that looks like. But then you can see there's 4 others like Dispatcher, Outject, Post-Construct, and Pre-Destroy. Yeah, I won't get into the details of those, but basically, yeah, these are what comes with Swiz and are common metadata tags that you'll use when architecting an application with Swiz. So just to get into what some of these look like, so with Inject, the first example is injection by type. So with Swiz, you'll give it a list of all the classes that you want managed by Swiz, so that Swiz is managing injecting these different objects into the classes. And by type is really simple. What it's going to do is Swiz is going to see that inject tag, and then it's going to look at the type of the property, and it's going to search its managed objects to see if there's an object that matches that type. And if it is, it'll inject it. Next is injection by name. So when you're creating the list of managed objects, you can also give them a name that you can reference with. What that would be used for is instead of by type, let's say you have 2 objects of the same type, you'd have to use name instead in order to reference it, or else it wouldn't know which one to use. And then next, injection by property, just to show an example. Instead of injecting the actual object, you can inject a property on that object. I'm hoping this isn't too complex for some people. So mediate, this is the other one I'll show, just being able to map an event to a method. So what this is going to do is you can see the event type that's specified above this function, and automatically whenever you dispatch that event in your application, it's going to know to call the save customer method. And then second, instead of passing in the event itself, this is just showing an alternative. You can specify which properties from the event you'd like to pass into the method. So just another example. And then, of course, there's other options you can add to it, like event priority and things like that. So Swiz metadata processors. So like I said before, things like inject and mediate were things that Swiz was handling for you. We just rewrote it so that instead of those classes finding this metadata themselves, we just created a core component in Swiz that all it does is find metadata, look at the list of processors, and pass to those processors the metadata that they're interested in handling. So what this does is allows you to build your own metadata processors, of course, for those of you that are interested in that. And I'll show some examples that have already been built. It was cool. We released this, and that same week we had 3 or 4 custom metadata processors appearing on the web. So what it really does is it's going to detect metadata in your managed objects and then also metadata in your views. So for example, like injecting your presentation model into your view, it'll handle that for you. And I'll go to the next. So the second piece that it does is with Flash, I don't know how many of you have used describe type? 1? Wow. Well, I've used it a bit. I'll tell you about it. Basically, so you have your class, and your class has a name, properties, methods. You can actually call describe type. It's a method included with the Flash player, and that returns XML document that describes everything in that class. So all of its private properties, public methods, what interfaces it extends, what its superclass is. So you can then look at that, and it includes metadata information, the important one. So you can then look at that and then start doing extra things with your with the class, like processing metadata. So what the reflection API does is, first of all, it's going to call describe type on any class you pass into it. It's next going to find all the different metadata that you've specified in that class, like bindable and inject and things like that. And then it's also going to cache that data so that the next time it comes across that class, it's not going to do this all over again, because describe type definitely has some performance issues if you're calling it a lot. And just you can see an example code at the bottom, the way that you would get a list of metadata tags for a specific metadata name, which I'll get into the code. So custom processor examples. This is the slide I was trying to wait to get to, so you can go, oh, I see what he's talking about. So you can see the first one. Someone created a metadata processor called Yahoo Finance, and you can pass it in a ticker symbol and then the number of days. And what's going to happen is when Swiz is looping through finding all the metadata, if it comes across that, it's going to call the Yahoo Finance metadata processor, which in turn looks at the ticker symbol, the days, and goes and finds the history, the last 60 days for this example, and sets it to the Adobe Stocks property in this example. So with one line of code, you didn't have to write very much. Some of these are obviously more practical than others, but just to show the power behind it. The idea you might use in your own applications with custom processors is anywhere where you're always doing, this common functionality all over the place. It's always these 3 lines of code that aren't a big deal, but you're putting them everywhere, and something like this is obviously a lot more readable than those 3 lines of code that you're using all over the place. So the next one, for example, someone created a log processor, and basically it's just going to create an instance of the log processor with Flex that's configured for the specific class that you're using. And then lastly, I'm not sure if anyone in this crowd has even seen it, but Rob Penner created something called AS3 Signals. Does anyone use that? 1, 2, a few. Instead of using, with Swiz, instead of using regular Flash events, you could map signals to a function, which you'd probably only understand if you've used signals. But so the last example I'm going to show with this is one that I created called URL mapping. And this one, compared to those others, this one is actually, at least I think, fairly useful in a real application. What it does is, I thought in applications that I'm usually creating, deep linking is something that everyone wants, but it's usually quite a bit to implement correctly. So what this will actually do is, I'll just jump ahead a slide. Basically, with one line, you can configure whenever the URL changes, it's going to look at the URL from the browser and see if there's a method that maps to that URL. So in this example, when the URL changes with the hashtag /helloworld, it knows to actually call the say hello world method. With that one piece of metadata, that's it. The next thing is again, I mentioned before with Bindable how you can have default properties. That's the same thing with URL mapping. So you can see the difference. I just didn't specify URL just to make it look a little simpler. Yeah, exactly. I got this idea from Spring with their request mapping annotation. Yeah, I don't know if there's any Java developers, but I guess you could see metadata is very similar to Java annotations, except that they're not type defined. So, and the next piece I can show is you can actually take parts of the URL and pass them in as parameters to the method. And you can also optionally set the browser window's title. And then lastly, talking about the mediate metadata, whenever, in this example, whenever the hello event is dispatched, it's also going to set the URL in the browser. So, which is kind of reverse. Instead of just looking for URL changes, it's actually going to change the URL for you with that same one line of URL mapping. So, how to build your own metadata processor. I'm actually going to end up building a really simple one called random. Basically, anytime you put random metadata above a property that's a number, whenever it finds that, it's going to set that number to a random number. So it's fairly simple. First thing is to get your Flex library project set up. So you'll create a new Flex library project, and you'll reference either the Swiz project if you have that code checked out, or just the Swiz SWIC so that you can actually use the classes that come with it. And the next piece that's specific to metadata is you'll need to add this keep AS3 metadata compiler argument to your project. And the reason you need to do that is because when the Flex compiler compiles your application, it gets rid of all the metadata unless it's specified as something you want to keep at runtime. So the next piece would be to actually create your metadata processor class. First, you would create a new class extending the base metadata processor. Base metadata processor just contains some common functionality that you would use in metadata processors. For example, only giving you the metadata information that you need and things like that. The next is you would define the metadata names you're interested in. So in your constructor, you just pass an array to the base metadata processor's constructor, just giving it the names that you need. It's an array just in case you want to process multiple metadatas with the same processor. And then next, you would just override setup metadata tag and tear down metadata tag. So setup, whenever it comes across metadata, it's going to pass in the metadata details, and it's called bean because of influences from Spring, but bean is actually the instance of the object that contained the metadata. And then lastly, you can optionally override init. So I won't get too far into that, but I'll show an example. And then finally, once you've created your processor, to use it in your application, it's fairly simple. This is standard Swiz configuration in MXML. And you just specify your processor in the custom processors array. And that's it. You can start using the metadata in your project. So I'll go ahead and actually just follow through with that. Actually, first I'll just show, so, oh, good, you can see that. So first of all, I've created this application called Random App, and you can see I've specified my Swiz config, and then also I've specified one view called main view. And in here, I have a property called score, which is set to 10.5. It's bindable so that my label can listen for changes to it, and then I just format it. I also have this random metadata tag on here, which does nothing at the moment, but I will build that. So let's see. So for now, it's pretty simple. You know, if I refresh this, it's always the same 10.5. So what I will do is now create a Flex library project, call it random, actually I'll call it Swiz random. And following through with those steps, on the build path, I'm going to add the Swiz framework so that I can have access to all of its classes. And also, oh, here it is. Thought I lost it. In here, I'm just going to add keep AS3 metadata plus equals so that it doesn't forget ones that are already specified. Random. And now what I'm going to do is just actually create the metadata class. Random metadata processor. I'm going to extend base metadata processor. Oh, that's weird. For some reason I created this beforehand to actually make sure I didn't mess it up, and it didn't delete the old files, it looks like. Maybe just let me delete, oh, here we go. Okay, yeah, let me start over. Swiz random. Quickly do this again. Projects. Okay, now I'll get back. So I'm gonna create the class. So first I'll give it a package name, Swiz framework. Oops, framework processors, random metadata processor. Okay. So first, now that I've created the class, I'm going to pass to the base metadata processor the metadata that I'm interested in, so random. And then next, I'm going to override setup metadata tag. And then you'll see here, I'm going to set the property on whichever object it's passing in. So bean is the object, whether it's a view or a managed object. There's metadata tag dot host is whatever the metadata tag was above, whether it's a class, a property, or method. So I'm going to go metadata tag dot host dot name. And that's going to give me the property name that the random metadata was above. And I'm just going to go equals math.random times 100. And now, oh, come on. I'm going to go into my random app now and just add that project to my application. And in random app, now that I have a custom processor I want to use, I'm just going to specify that, custom processors. And obviously, this is complete overkill for getting a random number to appear, but it's just a really easy example. So don't do this in a real application. Woohoo. So there you go. Next, I'm going to do a bit more customization to that. So you can see I'm grabbing a random number between 1 and 100. I'll actually add, I'll look for maximum. Set that to 100. And that's still doing the exact same thing. But what I could actually do is in my main application file here, I now have some customizations I can do, like change this to 1,000 if I want. Cool. And then lastly, what I'll do is I'll just show how you can use parameters from the metadata. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if, let's see, if it has a parameter called maximum. I'll just copy this for now. What I'll do is if it does, then I'll get maximum. Oh. sure that's giving me a number. Else I'll just use the global setting. So first I'll just run this again, make sure I didn't bust everything. Still works. Now what I can do is actually in the metadata right here, I can specify maximum. So let's say, here, a whole bunch of numbers. Cool. So that's really it for being able to create your own custom metadata processor. Does anyone have any questions? Yep.
What about typing? So I noticed putting random in there, when you actually set your variable there. So when you're injecting that, is there any way to make that more strongly typed? So put random metadata tag above the string, for instance.
Yeah, so the question was, what about typing and how you can type check against that? I mean, yeah, if you put random above a string, that could cause some issues. But you would actually just have to do the checking yourself. There's not going to be any compile time checking, but you can, I believe from right here, host, you can get the host type from the reflection API. So from that, you can then modify your logic to do whatever you need or not do anything. Any other questions? Yep.
Have you thought of metadata definitions like the use validation framework for type checking and all that stuff?
Sorry, I half heard of it. Or sorry, heard half of that.
Well,
Yeah, or sorry, repeat the question.
so if you thought about to implement in a special layout in your Swiss framework to do a general validation, just like the use validation framework for the Java use technique stuff.
Yeah.
Just general metadata definitions pre-built in just for simple type checkings like string or integer or stuff or date or email or all those things.
Yeah, it's really tough. It would be nice if the solution that really needs to happen is the compiler to have support for that, which it doesn't right now. We do some things with Swiz, like in the mediate event example, the event that you specify, we do a check at runtime and give you an error if that event doesn't actually exist. But for metadata itself, it's just tough because, for example, we don't know whether you spelt something wrong or it's just something that Swiz isn't supposed to be handling. The only other option I can give is there's a project called, is it SourceMate? Yeah, SourceMate. And it's a plugin for Flash Builder that actually does autocomplete for metadata, and it has Swiz support built into it. So, but then again, yeah, for custom metadata, it probably won't. It definitely won't support that. But
I think it
But
does
yeah.
now. I think you can add your own.
Oh.
Your method in
Oh, cool. There we go. Any other questions? I'm glad there's questions. It means someone understood what I'm talking about.
Why was Swiz invented?
To rule the world. Actually, so there's Spring in Java, and then there's Cold Spring for Cold Fusion, which is something that Chris Scott worked on. And then he came into Flex and built Swiz, which is based on that. So.
Can you speak to resource issues using reflection
Sorry, what was the question?
Resource issues using reflection and the cost associated.
I can a little, like I haven't done a ton of performance testing. Definitely describe type. That definitely takes a performance hit, which is why we make sure we cache per class. So basically when your application first runs, we do it then, and then yeah, that definitely helps the caching. The next thing that we're looking into would be to cache all of that data at compile time, so be able to just create a compiler extension that does that, but that's not something we're too interested in yet. I've used Swiz with the custom metadata on some really large projects that are running fine. There's definitely no huge performance hit that I notice, but then again, we are doing things like caching and as many things as we can to help performance. Anything else? I don't know how I am for time.
You're right on.
Oh, okay. Oh, yep.
Would you be able to use new highlighted strings to compile my constants?
Yeah.
Would you be able to use that in case of custom, like in place of this?
No. Yeah, metadata is just plain text, so you can't. Yeah, you can't reference constants or anything like that, which would be awesome if you could.
Compile my constants.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. So like, yeah, static constants or anything like that. Yeah, you can't. It doesn't recognize that in the metadata, which would be nice if it did. Anything else? I think I'll wrap it up. And actually, if there's any other questions, just come bug me. So thanks for listening. Hopefully that's hurt.